There are moments when the world above the clouds reminds us who's really in charge. The sky darkens, the wind whispers, and a single flash cuts through everything mankind has ever built. Lightning, nature's purest form of power, silent until it strikes. For more than a century, we've learned to soar above mountains, oceans, and storms. We've built machines that can cross the planet in a single day. But in the end, every aircraft still answers to the same invisible master, the atmosphere itself. This is a story about the day when technology met nature and lost. When sensors failed, wires melted, and one spark changed everything. Because no matter how far we advance, one simple truth remains: humans learned to fly, but never controlled the sky. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe and leave a like. It truly helps this channel keep telling these stories that history tried to forget. Every flight you'll hear about in this episode is real, every second, verified by official investigation reports. These are not myths. These are the days when the sky itself turned electric. It was December the 8th, 1963. Pan Am Flight 214 had just taken off from San Juan, Puerto Rico, on its way to Philadelphia. The aircraft, a sleek Boeing 707 named Clipper Tradewind, made one final stop in Baltimore before its short final leg north. 81 passengers and crew were on board, most heading home for the holidays. Outside, the winter storm had begun to brew. The clouds were thick, the air electric, and the night sky above Maryland was alive with flashes of lightning. At 8:58 p.m., radar controllers watched the green blip of the 707 move steadily north of Elkton. Then, without warning, the dot simply vanished. Moments later, witnesses on the ground saw something no one could ever forget. A brilliant flash tore through the sky, followed by a fiery descent of burning wreckage. Farmers and townspeople ran toward the fields, but what they found was devastation. The remains of a great jetliner scattered across miles of countryside, the night still glowing from the fires. When investigators from the Civil Aeronautics Board arrived, they faced a mystery unlike any before. The weather was bad, yes, but airliners had flown through lightning storms countless times. Why had this one exploded? The debris told the story piece by piece. They found sections of the left wing blown outward, edges curled and scorched, as if something inside had detonated. Fuel tanks that should have been intact were ripped apart from within. Slowly, they realized what had happened. Lightning had struck the aircraft directly, entering through the left wingtip and traveling along the metal surface until it found a weak joint. Where two panels met, the electrical charge jumped the tiny gap, and that microscopic arc of electricity ignited the vapors inside the fuel tank. Within milliseconds, the tank exploded with the force of dynamite, tearing off the wing and sending the aircraft into an uncontrollable dive. No one survived. It was the first proven case in aviation history of lightning directly destroying a jetliner. Before Pan Am Flight 214, most pilots and engineers believed that lightning was not a threat. They thought modern jets acted like giant Faraday cages, that electricity flowed harmlessly around them and exited through small static wicks on the tail. But the explosion proved that theory dangerously wrong. The investigation concluded that the bonding between certain metal panels wasn't strong enough to allow electricity to pass safely. The lightning jumped across the seams, creating sparks deep inside a fuel-filled wing. In the aftermath, the industry changed forever. Every major airframe manufacturer, Boeing, Douglas, Lockheed, redesigned their electrical bonding systems. Fuel tanks were shielded with conductive layers. Venting systems were reimagined to prevent vapor buildup, and inspection protocols for static discharge paths were rewritten from scratch. Every modern airliner today, from the smallest regional jet to the Airbus, a 380 owes part of its lightning protection system to what was learned that night in Maryland. That one flash over the fields near Elkton marked a turning point. It reminded the world that even the most advanced technology can still fall victim to the simplest natural force. In just 1 second, lightning exposed a hidden flaw in human engineering and forced aviation to respect the power of nature once again. Pan Am Flight 214 may have vanished in an instant, but its lesson remains alive in every safe landing that follows a storm. The next time you see lightning dance across the clouds from your airplane window, Remember that protection above your head, that silent safety in the storm, was written in the fire of that December night, Christmas Eve, 1971. In the heart of Peru, the humid air shimmered with heat, the sky building a wall of dark clouds to the east. At Lima's Jorge Chavez Airport, a small Lockheed L-111 jet, Qantas Flight 508, prepared for takeoff toward the city of Pucallpa. On board were 92 passengers and crew, many traveling home for the holidays. Among them sat a 17-year-old girl named Juliane Kepke, the daughter of two German zoologists who worked deep in the Amazon rainforest. She had flown this route before, but today, the sky was angry. As the jet climbed over the Andes, the cabin lights flickered. Outside, lightning painted the clouds a ghostly white. Passengers stared silently at the streaks of electricity crawling across the windows. Moments later, the aircraft entered a massive cumulonimbus cloud, a towering thunderstorm that reached 40,000 feet. Turbulence shook the fuselage violently. Overhead bins burst open. Bags flew. Then, in an instant that no one would ever forget, a brilliant flash struck the left wing. The sound was not thunder, it was something sharper, closer, like a cannon firing inside the plane. The lightning bolt ignited fuel vapors in the left wing tank, triggering a violent explosion that tore off the wing. A second blast followed, ripping the fuselage apart mid-air. The plane disintegrated into the storm, scattering debris and people across the jungle canopy below. Juliane, still strapped into her seat, was hurled from nearly 10,000 feet. The world turned white, then green, then black. She later said it felt like falling inside a dream. Wind screaming, trees rushing up, and then silence. When she regained consciousness, she was lying beneath the dense green roof of the Amazon, miraculously alive. Her collarbone broken, one eye swollen shut, but breathing. Around her, nothing but jungle, no wreckage, no people, only insects and the distant sound of water. She had no food, no shoes, and no real sense of where she was. But she had one advantage no one else on that plane did. She had grown up in the rainforest. Her parents had taught her how to find clean water, how to follow streams that might lead to civilization. So, bleeding and weak, she began to walk. For 10 days, Juliane pushed through the dense undergrowth, her wounds infected, her body covered in insect bites. She followed the river, drinking from it, sleeping on muddy banks, swatting away swarms of mosquitoes. At night, she could hear the cries of howler monkeys, the hiss of snakes, and the endless buzzing of the rainforest. She saw fragments of the wreckage along the way, a seat, a shoe, a piece of metal, silent reminders of the disaster she had fallen from. On the 10th day, half-starved and feverish, she stumbled upon a small wooden shelter near a riverbank, a remote camp used by local lumber workers. They were stunned to find her alive, barefoot, barely able to speak. They cleaned her wounds, gave her food, and took her downriver to the nearest village. From there, she was flown back to civilization, the sole survivor of Qantas Flight 508. When investigators reached the crash site days later, they found the wreckage scattered across miles of jungle. All 91 others had perished. The probable cause: a lightning strike that ignited the fuel, combined with severe turbulence that tore the aircraft apart. It was one of the deadliest and most mysterious lightning-related crashes in history. Juliane Kepke's survival became a symbol of the fragile line between life and death, man and nature. She later returned to the jungle with filmmaker Werner Herzog to retrace her journey in the documentary Wings of Hope. She described it not as luck, but as knowledge, knowing the forest, trusting the river, understanding nature's rhythm. Her story reminds us that technology can fail in an instant, but human resilience can outlast even the storm. One lightning bolt destroyed a jet, but it couldn't extinguish the will to survive. It was the morning of February the 25th, 1985. A Delta Airlines Boeing 727 sat at Buffalo Airport, engines humming beneath a gray electric sky. The route was simple: Buffalo to Fort Lauderdale, a routine winter flight down the East Coast. But weather radar already showed trouble ahead, a long line of thunderstorms stretching hundreds of miles, the kind that turned the skies into a flashing wall of energy. Captain John Mackenzie, a veteran pilot with thousands of hours on the 727, briefed his crew carefully. They would climb high, avoid the worst of the cells, and rely on their instruments. For the first hour, everything went smoothly. Passengers chatted, coffee was served, and the aircraft cut through the high clouds like a silver arrow. But as the jet approached the Carolinas, the weather ahead began to boil. Massive cumulonimbus towers rising 20 miles into the sky, their edges glowing with lightning. At 37,000 feet, the first flash hit. It wasn't a strike on the aircraft itself, not yet, but close enough to make the entire cockpit glow white. The instruments flickered. The autopilot clicked off for a second, then re-engaged. The crew exchanged uneasy glances. Then, without warning, a second strike, direct, blinding, and deafening, hit the vertical stabilizer with a force that shook the aircraft. Passengers screamed as the cabin lights flickered and dimmed. In the cockpit, chaos. The yaw damper, the system that stabilizes the aircraft's side-to-side motion, suddenly failed. The rudder indicator froze. The jet began to yaw violently left and right, the nose twisting uncontrollably. The lightning had caused a severe electrical short, frying key components of the autopilot and severing the feedback loops between the control surfaces and the hydraulic servos. Mackenzie and his first officer immediately disconnected the autopilot and took over manually, but the rudder wasn't responding the way it should. It felt stiff, almost locked. The 727 began to roll left, losing altitude fast. Warning lights flashed across the panel. For a moment, they were caught in a slow, sickening spin. Mackenzie gripped the control column and used every ounce of strength to steady the aircraft, applying differential thrust, adding power to one engine, reducing it on the other to counteract the asymmetric drag. Slowly, painfully, the aircraft began to respond. It leveled out, shaking, but under control. Passengers sat in stunned silence. Some prayed. Others stared out the windows at the glowing clouds and the faint, strobing arcs of lightning outside. Inside the cockpit, the smell of burnt insulation filled the air. The flight engineer reported multiple circuit breakers tripped and hydraulic pressure fluctuating. They declared an emergency and diverted toward Richmond, Virginia, the nearest major airport within reach. The descent was harrowing. The crew had to fight constant yawing and unpredictable electrical surges. The anti-skid system had failed, one fuel gauge was dead, and the weather below was still turbulent. But somehow, through muscle, training, and instinct, they brought the 727 inches. The final approach was flown almost entirely by hand. No yaw damper, no autopilot, partial trim. As the runway lights appeared through the mist, Mackenzie held the control column steady, aligned the center line by feel, and touched down with a heavy but controlled landing. When investigators examined the aircraft later, they found that the lightning strike had entered through the tail, burned through the yaw damper control wires, and jumped across several electrical buses. The system that was supposed to isolate critical circuits had failed, allowing the surge to cascade through multiple redundant systems at once. It was a near disaster that exposed a fundamental weakness in how aircraft electrical systems handled extreme lightning strikes. Delta Flight 1080 became a case study in redundancy, how even triple-protected systems could fail under the right conditions. Boeing engineers worked closely with the FAA to redesign isolation protocols, ensuring that future lightning strikes couldn't cross from one power bus to another. That day, no one died. No fire, no crash, just a crew who refused to give up control when the sky tried to take it from them. And yet, for everyone who heard the story, one question lingered. If a single bolt could disable the most advanced systems in the air, what else could nature do when the sky decided to strike back? It was April the 4th, 1979. Transworld Airlines Flight 841, a Boeing 727 bound from New York to Minneapolis, cruised smoothly above 39,000 feet. It was night, clear skies, calm air, and a routine leg over Michigan. Inside the cabin, 182 passengers relaxed under the soft glow of reading lights. Drinks were served. The hum of the engines was steady. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary. Until, without warning, the aircraft rolled upside down. In an instant, calm turned to chaos. Passengers screamed as the world-inverted ceiling panels tore loose. Trays flew through the cabin, and bodies were pressed violently against seatbelts. The 727, now inverted, began a near-vertical dive toward the Earth. The cockpit alarms blared. Captain Harvey Hoot Gibson and his crew struggled to make sense of what was happening. The control column resisted input. The artificial horizon spun wildly, and the altimeter wound down like a stopwatch. The aircraft was losing altitude at more than 10,000 feet per minute. Outside, the lights of Detroit flashed closer with every passing second. Somewhere between 39,000 feet and 5,000, the 727's speed passed 400 knots, well beyond its design limit. The wings began to flex under the stress. But somehow, Gibson managed to keep the jet from disintegrating. With both hands, he fought the controls, leveling the wings at the last possible moment. The aircraft finally stabilized just above 5,000 feet, shaking violently but intact. The crew declared an emergency and diverted to Detroit Metropolitan Airport. Minutes later, the battered 727 touched down safely. Not a single life was lost. What had caused a modern airliner to roll upside down in clear weather? Theories spread immediately. Pilot error, mechanical failure, electrical interference. The NTSB investigation that followed would become one of the most debated in aviation history. According to the official report, the leading theory pointed toward a malfunction in the leading-edge slat system, the extendable panels on the front of the wings that help the aircraft generate lift at lower speeds. If the slats extended unexpectedly while at cruising altitude, they could cause a sudden and violent roll. But there was more to the story. The cockpit voice recorder captured no sign of panic before the event, suggesting the roll was completely unanticipated. Maintenance checks showed the autopilot system might have received a spurious electrical input, possibly triggered by interference, or a short circuit that commanded the slats to deploy. The sudden aerodynamic imbalance could have forced the aircraft to roll and enter a dive before the crew could react. Captain Gibson, however, maintained his innocence until his death. He insisted that he had not tampered with the controls, that the slats must have deployed on their own. Some investigators quietly agreed, pointing out that the electrical design of the 727 left certain components vulnerable to voltage spikes. Lightning, static buildup, or even electromagnetic interference from ground radar could theoretically cause such a chain of errors. But with no definitive evidence, the true cause would remain unsolved. The incident led to new scrutiny of how autopilot and hydraulic systems interacted where the mechanical stopped and the electrical began. Engineers realized that even in aircraft built with redundant systems, one bad input could still cascade through both networks, creating a situation no pilot could predict. It also reinforced the importance of manual flight discipline, always being ready to hand fly when the systems behaved unpredictably. TWA Flight 841 remains one of aviation's great mysteries, an airplane that rolled upside down, dove 34,000 feet, and survived. A captain whose reputation was shadowed by questions he could never fully answer. And an investigation that reminded the industry that between human hands and computer logic lies a fragile line. One bolt of static. One misread signal that separates control from chaos. That night over Michigan, the passengers of Flight 841 learned a truth that every pilot knows deep down. Even when the sky is clear, it can still turn against you in an instant. It was July the 25th, 2000, a warm summer afternoon outside Paris. On the ramp at Charles de Gaulle Airport, a sleek, needle-nosed Concorde sat shimmering in the heat. Air France, Flight 4590, bound for New York City, was about to begin its short transatlantic sprint, the most luxurious and the fastest way to cross the ocean. Only 100 passengers were on board, most of them German tourists beginning a dream trip. In the cockpit sat one of Air France's most experienced supersonic crews. The checklists were complete. The world's only supersonic airliner began to taxi toward runway 26 right. For the Concorde, takeoff was always a show of raw power. 4 Rolls-Royce Olympus engines roaring, afterburners igniting. flames streaming from the tail as the aircraft pushed through the sound barrier on every flight. But on this day, something unseen waited on the runway ahead. A small piece of titanium debris, no bigger than a ruler, had fallen minutes earlier from a Continental DC-10 that had just departed. It was an ordinary strip of metal until it became the catalyst for one of the most dramatic accidents in aviation history. As the Concorde accelerated past 170 knots, its left main landing gear rolled directly over that titanium strip. The razor-sharp metal sliced open one of the left tires, which exploded instantly. Fragments of rubber, weighing several kilograms, shot upward at incredible speed, slamming into the underside of the wing with the force of a cannon. One of those chunks struck the bottom of fuel tank number 5. The shockwave inside the tank caused it to rupture. Within seconds, thousands of liters of jet fuel began streaming out in a bright, shimmering trail. Then came the spark. Investigators would later find evidence that the impact and vibration caused a nearby electrical wire, part of the landing gear wiring harness, to arc. That tiny flash of electricity ignited the escaping fuel, creating a fireball that raced along the wing. Flames engulfed the engine. From the control tower, witnesses watched in horror as the world's fastest passenger jet struggled to climb. The aircraft yawed left, flames trailing hundreds of feet behind it. Inside the cockpit, alarms filled the air. Engine, to failure. Fire warning left wing. Fuel pressure low. The crew tried desperately to shut down the burning engines and gain altitude, but the asymmetric thrust made control nearly impossible. The Concorde, overloaded with fuel for its planned ocean crossing, could not climb on 2 engines. It lifted briefly to 200 feet, then rolled left, stalled, and crashed into a hotel near the town of Gonesse. All 109 people on board, and 4 on the ground, lost their lives. The investigation by France's BEA was meticulous. They traced the chain of events from the titanium strip to the tire burst, the fuel tank rupture, and finally, the ignition. The conclusion was chillingly simple. A single piece of metal debris, just one, had destroyed the world's most advanced airliner. But it wasn't just bad luck. The Concorde's fuel tanks, made of aluminum, were never designed to resist the kind of shock impact that modern composite tanks can withstand. There were no liners, no internal barriers, and the electrical wiring running beneath the wing lacked modern isolation protection. In the aftermath, the Concorde fleet was grounded for more than a year. Engineers redesigned the fuel tanks, adding Kevlar lining to prevent ruptures, and rewired critical systems with better shielding and grounding to prevent sparks. The tires were replaced with new burst-resistant types, and the runways at Paris and London were equipped with improved debris detection systems. But the damage to the aircraft's image and to the world's confidence was irreversible. The era of supersonic passenger travel never truly recovered. The accident of Air France Flight 4590 was not just the end of a flight, it was the end of a dream. The Concorde had symbolized the triumph of technology over nature, faster than sound, faster than time. Yet in the end, it was brought down not by turbulence or thunder, but by a spark, a wire, and a shard of metal lying unnoticed on a runway. From that day on, every major manufacturer, Airbus, Boeing, Embraer, overhauled their fuel tank wiring and bonding standards. The lesson was written in fire that even the smallest electrical imperfection left unchecked could turn into disaster. The Concorde burned bright, like lightning across the sky, beautiful, powerful, and gone in an instant. October the 7th, 2008. Over the endless blue of the Indian Ocean, Qantas Flight 72 cruised smoothly at 37,000 feet. The Airbus A330, en route from Singapore to Perth, was halfway through its journey. The sky was clear, the weather calm, and the flight was routine, one of those long, uneventful stretches that define modern aviation. On board were 315 people, many returning home after business trips or holidays. The pilots, both highly experienced, chatted quietly in the cockpit as the autopilot guided the jet with precision. Then, without warning, the calm ended. A chime sounded. Red lights flashed across the instrument panel. The flight computers began producing impossible data: altitude, airspeed, and attitude values jumping violently back and forth. At first, the crew suspected a single sensor glitch, but then the airplane itself reacted. In less than a second, the nose pitched sharply down, throwing the aircraft into a near-vertical dive. Passengers who had been eating or reading were suddenly weightless, then slammed against the cabin ceiling. Trays, coffee pots, and even unsecured laptops flew through the air. Dozens of people were injured instantly. The captain yanked back on the control column, fighting to level the aircraft. He managed to pull out of the dive at about 29,000 feet. The cabin erupted in screams and confusion. Oxygen masks dangled from the ceiling, lights flickered, and the smell of burnt plastic filled the air. Flight attendants crawled through the aisle, trying to calm passengers and tend to the wounded. But before anyone could catch their breath, it happened again. The plane pitched violently forward for a second time, this time even faster. People not wearing seatbelts were thrown against the ceiling with bone-breaking force. The sound of impact echoed through the cabin. When the pilots finally regained control, the cockpit displays looked like a storm of nonsense. Warnings scrolled across the screen faster than they could read. Stall, overspeed, flight path data invalid. Every major system was reporting faults, yet the aircraft was still flying. They declared an emergency and diverted to Learmonth, a remote airbase on the western coast of Australia. As they descended, the flight controls felt sluggish, unpredictable, like the airplane was alive, but confused. Somehow, they managed to land safely. 110 passengers were injured, 20 seriously, but everyone survived. The investigation by the Australian Transport Safety Bureau took years, and what they found was as extraordinary as it was disturbing. The root cause wasn't mechanical, and it wasn't pilot error. It was a computer specifically, one of the 3 Air Data Inertial Reference Units, or ADIRUs, which feed flight information to the Airbus's main control computers. One of the sensors inside the unit began sending erratic data, false spikes in pitch, altitude, and speed. The flight control software interpreted those spikes as real and reacted instantly, commanding nose-down inputs to protect the aircraft from a stall that didn't actually exist. But here's what made it worse. Those false signals weren't just random. They were the result of something engineers later called an electrical ghost input, a tiny moment of electromagnetic interference that triggered a chain reaction inside the ADIRU's logic system. The faulty data spread through the interconnected computers faster than the human crew could intervene. In essence, the airplane was fighting ghosts, invisible energy pulses moving through its own nervous system. The event shook the entire aviation world. The Airbus A330 was one of the most sophisticated airliners ever built, with triple redundancy, multiple computers, and layers of protection designed to make human error nearly impossible. Yet a single electronic fault had caused 2 uncontrolled dives. Qantas Flight 72 became the defining case for understanding electromagnetic fault propagation, how a momentary charge, a corrupted data packet, or a timing error could ripple through modern fly-by-wire systems. After the incident, Airbus and regulatory agencies introduced major software updates to all A330 and A340 aircraft. New safeguards were added to reject conflicting data, and the ADIRU units were redesigned to isolate faulty sensors before they could affect flight controls. That day, above the Indian Ocean, Qantas Flight 72 survived not because of its computers, but because of its pilots. And in the quiet after landing, as paramedics helped the injured and investigators examined the aircraft, one truth echoed through the hangar. Sometimes, it's not the storm outside that threatens a plane, it's the storm within. September the 2nd, 1998. Swissair Flight 111 departed New York's JFK Airport at 8:18 p.m., bound for Geneva. On board were 229 passengers and crew, business travelers, families, diplomats, and scientists returning home. The aircraft, a McDonnell Douglas MD-11, was one of the most advanced jets of its time. The weather was calm, the Atlantic winds steady. Everything about that night seemed routine. At first, the flight progressed smoothly. The MD-11 climbed to 33,000 feet, and the pilots, Captain Zimmerman and First Officer Stefan Lowe, settled into cruise. Two experienced aviators, respected and confident. But 53 minutes into the flight, the calm began to unravel. A faint smell of smoke drifted through the cockpit. It wasn't the acrid scent of burning oil or fuel, it was electrical, sharp, almost metallic. At 9:10 p.m., the pilots radioed air traffic control. "Pan, pan, pan, we have smoke in the cockpit." They were offered the nearest diversion, Halifax, Nova Scotia. They accepted immediately, descending through the night toward the Canadian coastline. But as they prepared to turn, the situation deteriorated faster than anyone expected. Behind the cockpit ceiling panels, hidden from view, a tangle of wires snaked above the pilots' heads, part of the aircraft's in-flight entertainment and electrical systems. Investigators would later find that the insulation on those wires, made from a material called metallized mylar, had begun to arc. The insulation was thin, reflective, and designed to prevent heat buildup, but under stress, it could ignite. The first arc produced a spark. That spark became flame. The flame raced along bundles of wiring, feeding on insulation and spreading above the cockpit ceiling. The fire moved silently at first, undetected by any warning systems, then erupted into smoke that filled the air. The pilots switched off non-essential power, cutting electrical load in hopes of isolating the fault. They began their descent, aiming to land within 20 minutes. But the fire was faster. In minutes, vital systems began to fail, radios flickered, flight instruments dimmed, and the autopilot disconnected. The heat behind the panels reached over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Components melted. Circuit breakers popped one after another. The smell of burning insulation turned to choking black smoke. Inside the cockpit, visibility dropped to near zero. Captain Zimmerman and First Officer Lowe struggled to keep control, relying on partial instruments and sheer instinct. At 9:24 p.m., their final transmission crackled over the radio. "Swissair 111, we are declaring an emergency." Seconds later, all contact was lost. At 10:21 p.m., the aircraft struck the Atlantic Ocean near Peggy's Cove, Nova Scotia, at nearly 300 miles per hour. There were no survivors. The investigation, led by the Transportation Safety Board of Canada, would take more than 4 years, one of the most complex in aviation history. Over 2 million pieces of wreckage were recovered from the ocean floor. The evidence revealed that the fire had started near the cockpit ceiling, likely from arcing wires in the entertainment system that ignited the mylar insulation. The materials above the cockpit had burned fiercely, releasing toxic fumes and heat that overwhelmed the crew before they could complete an emergency landing. The tragedy of Swissair Flight 111 transformed the aviation industry. It forced regulators and manufacturers to confront a long-ignored danger: wiring, insulation, and flammable materials hidden behind panels. Mylar insulation, once considered safe, was banned from new aircraft designs. Airlines worldwide began replacing similar materials in existing fleets. Fire detection and suppression standards were rewritten from the ground up. Modern jets now carry smoke detectors in cargo bays, behind panels, even inside lavatories. Lessons written in the memory of this flight: wiring insulation must meet strict flammability tests, and crews are trained to treat any hint of smoke as a potential catastrophe. Swissair Flight 111 became known as the fire in the wires, a haunting reminder that in aviation, the danger is not always visible. Sometimes it hides in the spaces between systems, in the unseen arcs of electricity that run through every inch of metal and wire. 229 lives were lost that night, but their legacy endures in every aircraft that now flies safer, quieter, and stronger through the dark skies over the Atlantic. April the 6th, 1993. A brand new McDonnell Douglas MD-11 belonging to China Eastern Airlines prepared for a long flight from Beijing to Los Angeles. The aircraft was only months old, gleaming white and red under the morning sun. On board were 235 passengers and 20 crew members, diplomats, business travelers, and families bound for the United States. The captain, Wang Wei, had thousands of flight hours, many of them on the MD-11. The flight plan was smooth and uneventful. For the first several hours, everything went according to plan. The MD-11 climbed to 39,000 feet and settled into cruise over the Pacific Ocean. Passengers relaxed, some watching movies, others napping. But 5 hours into the flight, the calm began to shatter. The autopilot suddenly disengaged with a sharp chime. The aircraft jolted slightly, then pitched upward violently. Passengers screamed as the jet began to climb sharply, pressing them back into their seats. Then, without warning, the nose dropped. The MD-11 fell nose down, and those who were unbuckled were launched into the ceiling. In a matter of seconds, chaos filled the cabin. Coffee pots and trays flew through the air, oxygen masks fell, and people hit the overhead panels with terrifying force. Some passengers later said it felt like a roller coaster that had suddenly gone off the rails. The aircraft oscillated up and down, first climbing, then diving, over and over. In the cockpit, the crew fought to understand what was happening. Flight data readings were erratic, the control surfaces moving unpredictably. Then, as suddenly as it began, the motion stopped. The captain regained control, leveling the MD-11 at a safe altitude. The cabin, however, was in ruined debris everywhere, injured passengers crying out. Dozens were hurt, and 2 people suffered fatal injuries from the violent impacts. When the NTSB investigated, they discovered a complex and unsettling chain of events. During cruise, a piece of electrical wiring in the center console had short-circuited, sending a false signal to the automatic leading-edge slat system, the surfaces that extend during takeoff and landing to improve lift. The aircraft's computers interpreted that false signal as a command to deploy the slats, even though the plane was flying at high altitude and high speed. When the slats extended unexpectedly, the aerodynamic balance of the MD-11 was instantly disrupted. The flight control system reacted to what it believed was an impending stall, trimming the stabilizer nose down, but then, as the crew tried to counter it, the system overcorrected again. It became a tug-of-war between pilot inputs and automated responses. The MD-11's advanced flight control computers, designed to help the crew, were now amplifying the problem. The investigation also uncovered another issue. An internal shock sensor, meant to dampen abrupt control movements, had malfunctioned under the surge caused by the electrical short. This allowed the control surfaces to move faster and more aggressively than intended. In essence, the aircraft's own protective systems had turned against it. After the incident, Boeing and McDonnell Douglas engineers issued urgent service bulletins for all MD-11 operators. Electrical wiring to the slat control modules was rerouted and shielded to prevent cross-interference. Fault isolation protocols were rewritten, ensuring that one bad circuit couldn't trigger a cascade of automated reactions. The event also reinforced a vital human lesson that even with autopilot and computers, pilots must be ready to take full manual control in an instant. China Eastern Flight 583 survived the incident, but the cabin injuries were severe. The photographs of the aftermath, ceiling panels broken, seats twisted, told a story of how fragile stability can be in the air. A momentary arc of electricity, a single false command, and a modern jetliner was seconds from catastrophe. The lesson from Flight 583 spread throughout aviation. Systems should never share pathways that can fail together, and automation should never be allowed to override the human understanding of flight. It was another chapter in aviation's uneasy relationship with electricity, invisible, instant, and unforgiving. That day, the passengers of Flight 583 learned what every engineer since has come to respect. In the sky, one spark is enough to bring even the most advanced machine to its knees. In the end, every wire, every switch, and every circuit we build still answers to the same force, the sky itself. We have filled the heavens with machines of perfect symmetry and logic, powered by data, protected by layers of technology. But above the clouds, where air turns thin and storms are born, nature still whispers the same warning. Electricity is never truly under our control. Each lightning bolt that crosses the horizon is a reminder written in light, a silent message from nature that power and precision are not the same as mastery. We can design, predict, and simulate. We can train pilots and build computers to react faster than any human ever could. But when voltage meets vapor and static meets steel, the sky reminds us that perfection is only borrowed, never owned. From the sparks that brought down the Pan Am jet in 1963 to the invisible currents that misled a modern airliner decades later, every flash of energy has shaped how we fly. Every tragedy has rewritten the way engineers think about safety, insulation, and trust. The lessons written in smoke and lightning have built the very foundations of today's aircraft. But even now, with all our progress, one truth remains. We do not command the sky, we coexist with it. Because no matter how advanced our machines become, the sky never forgives our assumptions.